Vatic Ventures Corp is a potash exploration company focused on the Korat Basin in Thailand, the world's largest undeveloped potash resource. Vatic's management has extensive potash exploration and development experience in Thailand. Vatic will have marketing advantage compared to Western producers. Drill program commences this spring. Vatic trades on the TSX Venture, symbol VCV, and on Frankfurt, symbol V8V2. Visit our website, vaticventures.com.
Welcome to the Goddard Report. Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Kris Sims, BC Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Welcome back to the show, Kris.
Always wonderful to join you.
The Kinder Morgan court decision where they have to reconsult Aboriginal groups and take into consideration an extra tanker a day amongst the orcas. What's the opinion of the Taxpayers Federation? Haven't we spent enough money on this? Is that kind of it?
It is, and it's really something that's central to what we're doing. Not only do our supporters overwhelmingly favor the construction of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, but we've also thrown in many different ways to be interveners in this case, in many of these cases when it deals with the Trans Mountain. That means that we're willing to show up in court to give documents, to give evidence, and to give arguments in favor of the construction of Trans Mountain. And to be clear, we were most in favor of the thing back when a private corporation was footing the bill. They were going to be hiring thousands and thousands of people, mostly at very good wages, that results in many thousand more other jobs that go downstream, so to speak. And they were paying full freight. And what we need to remember is that this issue had won 17 times previously in court. The pipeline had won 17 previous times. And this project had been green-lit, had been given a go approval by successive federal governments, both by Prime Minister Stephen Harper and current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And so with all that being said, we fully supported it. Then, bizarrely, the Trudeau government dragged its feet for more than a year. The company basically threw up its hands, walked away, and left taxpayers holding this bag. They spent more than $4.5 billion to buy the existing pipeline that runs from Edmonton to Burnaby, of course, and they were planning on spending billions more to twin it, which is what Kinder Morgan had wanted to do all along. So that was bad enough, and now we have a federal court judge that has just struck it down on the basis of what she perceived as a lack of consultation with First Nations peoples and a potential threat to the killer whale population, to orcas off of the west coast. She mentioned the term killer whale, actually, 57 times in her judgment. And so this is something that, resource sector families are reeling about. I've been there. I was a little kid when the NEP was put through, and my dad suddenly had no oil patch job to go back to. It's brutal. It's absolutely brutal what this will now do to these 8,000 families. This means that people's homes are going to get foreclosed. It means that their trucks are going to get repossessed. It means that their kids will probably have no new clothes, like for years. It's grim. And frankly, we think that those workers in the resource sector, in the oil and gas sector, and their families, they need to be considered when court cases like this come up too. But I did want to give a bit of hope. My colleague, the federal director, Aaron Woodrick, who's an expert in law, has taken a really hard look at this judgment. And he thinks that there is a way to meet the court's recommendations. That if you read carefully into the wording of the judgment, that they say that new consultation with First Nations peoples can happen in an efficient manner. That means quickly. And so actually there is apparently a little light of hope written into this judgment. And if the federal government reads it right and gets working on it like yesterday, there's still a chance, we think, that this could go through.
Now, we know there have been very vocal opponents in the Aboriginal community to the pipeline, but what about the 40 or 50 First Nations that signed on with the pipeline because they expected to get long-term benefits and jobs out of it?
This is of critical importance. So a lot has been made in the media of First Nations peoples opposing this pipeline. Number one, that's a huge generalization. Number two, as you rightly point out, I think it's 43 separate First Nations regions and groups have signed on in favor of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And it runs through their territory. What a lot of people seem to forget is that it already runs right now. It's been running since the 50s. It exists right now in time and space between Edmonton and Burnaby. And it runs through a lot of different First Nations and Native territories. One of them is actually right here in the Fraser Valley, and we hear from him often in the media, and that is Chief Ernie Cray of the Chiem people. And he fully supports the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And so do a lot of other chiefs and leaders throughout that region, throughout the route that it actually takes for this pipeline. And what's also really important to remember is that there are people, like literally from all ethnicities, races, religions, all walks of life, who work in the oil sands. They work up in Fort Mac. They're from all over Canada. They could be First Nations, they could be non-First Nations, they could be new immigrants, they could be old immigrants, you name it. A lot of them from Atlantic Canada, from BC, the prairies, up north. They all fly in to this epicenter of resource development for good-paying jobs, and they work really hard. This is the oil sands. This is the oil patch, and that includes First Nations people who support, obviously, the development of the oil sands and getting the product out to market. And so I think that more attention does need to be paid to those who are speaking up in favor of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And I really wanted to stress that I think nowadays it could be worse than it was during the NEP. Back during the NEP, those of us who are old enough to remember, there was, of course, a global oil crisis. And the NEP was imposed ham-fistedly, and one could argue that the federal government was trying to fix the problem. That was a global problem. Unfortunately, it had terrible results for the West, as all of us know who worked in it and lived in it. But now we have similar things happening, but fellow Canadians are cheering it. Back in the late 70s and early 80s, people didn't have this sort of hate on for the oil and gas sector that some of them do now. So nowadays, just imagine being a member of these families who have just been told, guess what? You're no longer going to be making about $100,000 a year for 4 years. Zero. You've got zero. In some cases, if you're a private contractor, you've got no EI either. You've just been thrown off a cliff. Then you turn on the news and you see fellow Canadians cheering about it, including elected members of parliament. And they're cheering about it often while wearing synthetic clothes made from petroleum product fibers. They're yelling it, keep it in the ground, through a plastic megaphone. They're streaming it and tweeting it on their plastic smartphones. So while they're using the lifeblood of the modern world, oil and gas, they're yelling to keep that oil and gas in the ground, and they're celebrating these 8,000 people losing their jobs. And this is something that former Saskatchewan Premier Brad Wall has brought up, that he truly thinks that this is causing severe Western alienation, and it is causing some frays in the Federation. And unfortunately, I think he's right. This has got the potential to do a lot of damage.
We'll have more with Kris Sims right after the break.
Hi, I'm Douglas Mason, President and CEO of Rainy Mountain Royalty Corp, RMO, on the TSX Venture Exchange. Rainy Mountain's Brunswick property is located in the Rideout Shear Zone in Ontario, with grab samples running as high as 32 grams per ton gold. A follow-up drill program to test numerous targets located by recent groundwork is planned for early 2018. Please visit our website at rmroyalty.com.
Cypress Development Corp's flagship lithium project is located just east of Albemarle's Silver Peak mine in the heart of Clayton Valley, Nevada. A 12-hole exploration drill program for lithium-enriched claystone on Cypress's 100% controlled properties is now underway. Cypress Development Corp trades on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol CYP, the pink CYDVF, and on Frankfurt's C1Z1. For more information, please visit our website, cypressdevelopmentcorp.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Kris Sims. Kris, could the Green Party be summarized as being the anti-job party right now?
As of right now, yes. When we're talking especially in the context of, and I mean steel-toed jobs, those jobs that pay for homes, that pay for trucks, that pays for hockey school. They're the big difference makers, okay? Resource sector jobs especially. To see Green Party leaders crowing and celebrating, killing 8,000 of those jobs, 830, it's astounding. And so what's really frustrating for these people while they're busy scrambling to find out how they're going to afford their mortgage or if the bank is going to come take their car, what's astounding for these people is that quite often these Green Party leaders will be not only cheering them losing their jobs, they're demanding alternatives that don't practically exist yet. Like, they're saying, oh, let's use wind and solar. There's a really cool thing on Twitter where it follows what resources are being currently used, especially in Alberta. There isn't the equivalent for BC yet, but it shows where the electricity is coming from. And it's usually more than 90% so-called fossil fuels. It's oil, gas, coal, you name it. So more than 90%. And yet, quite often we'll hear leaders from different levels of the Green Party on national media and local media breezily say, oh, switch to alternatives. Those alternatives don't exist in the capacity that we need them to as a modern functioning economy. But they keep just dismissing it and saying that we should. But that's like saying we should use dilithium crystals from Star Trek. It isn't there right now. And so while we're using oil and gas, we need to support oil and gas, especially the workers in it. And so I think for a lot of people who've been watching the resource sector carefully, I think that's where the disconnect comes from when it comes to the Green Party.
Where does the Green Party expect to get tax revenue if there's no oil and gas to collect taxes from?
That's a great question, and I've asked various members of the party before. And when I say this, I've got friends in the Green Party. I mean it. Like, I worked closely with different members of the Green Party, especially out in Ontario. And sometimes, they've got neat ideas. They support things like Uber, or they want more deregulation. There's all sorts of green roofs, with sod, things like that, recycling, things that most people can get behind. Protecting an endangered species habitat. A lot of people can get behind those things. But then when it gets into the big stuff, like you just said, boom, oil and gas, mass taxation, mass revenue, like a key pillar of the economy, it just dissolves. It dissolves into wishful thinking. And they'll often say things like, oh, we'll take it from wind and solar and switch over. And to use an example, a good example from Ontario that tried doing this, they tried imposing the Green Energy Act. Back then it was the Ontario Liberals under Premier Dalton McGuinty. They brought in the Green Energy Act, and that's where they artificially started using wind and solar more often for their electrical grid. But in this case, say your price for power in Ontario was on average 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. That's the market rate, the going rate, no matter what it comes from, hydro, coal, nuclear, whatever, 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. The Green Energy Act, in some cases, saw them signing contracts for 30 years with solar and wind providers, in some cases for 80 cents per kilowatt hour. That 77-cent markup was then paid by the hydro customer for power they never used. So even if you're switching off all your lights and not using any electricity for your heat, and you're doing your drying and your dishes at night, sometimes at midnight in some cases, you're still paying 78 cents more per kilowatt hour for power that you're not using. And so it became a real scandal, and that's frankly one of the reasons why Doug Ford won the last election in Ontario, because hydro became unaffordable. And again, that's an example where they said, oh, just switch over. It's not so simple.
We'll have more with Kris Sims right after this.
Media recognition from Bloomberg, Reuters, recycling trade publications, patented process for 100% recovery of critical metals, including cobalt, lithium, nickel, manganese, aluminum. American Manganese is focused on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. American Manganese trades on the TSX Venture, AMY, the US, AMYZF, and Frankfurt 2AM. For more information, visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
Don't miss out. Stay informed. Receive the HowStreet.com weekly recap with thought-provoking podcasts, radio, and articles delivered to your inbox. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage at HowStreet.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Kris Sims. Kris, a favorite occupation of politicians is to re-announce projects, and we saw Prime Minister Trudeau and Premier John Horgan of BC re-announce that Surrey and Vancouver are going to get major transportation projects. How many times have they done this now?
I think, I could stand corrected, but I think this is the third time that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has come out to the West Coast region to talk about this transit money. And we need to keep in mind that this is part of like the big transit push that they were doing here in Metro Vancouver, and he's showing up because of the federal portion of those taxpayer dollars that is being forked over. And then, of course, there is the municipal portion and then the provincial portion. And that relationship between the cities of Metro Vancouver and Victoria, the provincial portion, got messed up a while ago when the province said, oh, by the way, jack up your gas tax again in Metro Vancouver to pay for this thing, which they are doing. So I think this is the third time that the feds have been out here to re-announce this. And what's really, from a communication standpoint, the optics were bad because the Prime Minister showed up on Tuesday to, at least in pictures, symbolically speaking, hand $1 billion or so over to Premier Horgan, who is seen by many now in the pipeline world, in the resource world, as a job killer. And keep in mind, those jobs were just killed on Thursday afternoon. Prime Minister shows up on Tuesday morning and optically hands over money again. It didn't look very good, and it made a lot of national media.
The Premier gladly hikes carbon and gasoline prices, but at the same time he's against the pipeline that would bring cheaper gasoline to the Lower Mainland. Is this a two-faced announcement? It is.
It is, frankly. And we also need to keep in mind that transit, which is all well and good if you like, light rapid transit or if you like SkyTrain, whatever. But we need to keep in mind that even the cars that you're using for transit, the pillars that you would build if you used SkyTrain, or the rail you're laying if you're using LRT at grade, all of that requires oil and gas to function, to be constructed, to be hauled, to be installed, every single bit of it. This stuff doesn't work on solar panels. And so, yeah, it is hypocritical and it is two-faced. And again, it points out this strange disconnect between our political leaders who actually their own pensions are, of course, heavily invested in things like the oil sands, in things like the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Of course they are. Why? Because oil and gas is a lifeblood of our economy. It's just a no-brainer they'd be invested with their pensions. And so all of that will happen while they're busy trying to kill it. It just doesn't make any sense. If 8,000 jobs in the maple syrup industry in Eastern Canada were suddenly slashed off by a court decision, that would be terrible for those families and those workers. And it would be bad to see people mocking them or cheering the loss of those jobs. But technically, logically, we could probably live without maple syrup if we really, really had to. Nobody would like it, but we could. But we couldn't continue to function in our modern way in our economy without oil and gas. And yet people are still damning it. It just defies logic.
Do you think we'll ever see another referendum on whether we want to pay higher taxes to support transit?
That's a great question. And as many of your listeners will remember, under my predecessor, Jordan Bateman, there was a big referendum on, do you want to pay a sales tax, a tax hike to pay for transit in Metro Vancouver, in the Lower Mainland? And the people came out and they said no. Politicians from all stripes are lining up saying yes. All of these very academic expert people who love transit so much were all saying yes. But the people who'd be paying the bill said no. So it failed. I need to point out here, too, that back during that referendum, if all those mayors who said they loved transit so much, and this is all the future, and it's all important, and we get that, if all those mayors would have just taken 0.5% of their tax increases, their income from property taxation for future years, 0.5% of it, if they would have taken just that much and left it for transit, it would have more than paid for their portion of it. They wouldn't have needed to increase taxes on anybody to pay for it. But they didn't want to do that because they'd rather spend that 0.5% in their own little backyard projects. They wouldn't want to put into the collective will and the collective good, even though they say they want to. But what's happened now is that the provincial government has stripped us of the right to have a referendum anymore on hiking taxes to pay for transit. So this happened a while back, and it's something actually you can see frequently if you ask her. The minister responsible for municipalities, Selena Robinson, will crow and cheer that they've removed the right and the requirement of a referendum to hike taxes on us to pay for transit. They can just do it now. They don't even need to ask us. Even though the people came out and the people said no, well, the people were just ignored.
They plan to build light rail in Surrey. Are people going to use it, and could it be a waste of taxpayer money?
That's a great point. So now that we're past the argument and the vote and the reneging, frankly, the ignoring of the people's will during that vote, and the money's already been ponied up, and here we are. Now we're hearing from lots of people, if you tune in to talk radio, if you read opinion columns and read the letters to the editor, which are important to keep track of, now we're hearing that people in Surrey especially, and down that Fraser Highway corridor that leads out from Surrey out into Langley and further down the valley, that they don't want at grade, so ground level, LRT, light rapid transit, those little trains. A lot of people now are saying they want a SkyTrain. Just extend the Surrey line all the way down as far as they can out the valley along the Fraser Highway corridor. Maybe out to Willowbrook or have it end there, not sure. If that means that they're not going to hike taxes on us again, that's something that we could at least look at. Like I said, now that it's all been cordoned off anyway, that money's already been sent down the road, so to speak. Now we're hearing, now all of a sudden the people who actually live there, who commute, don't want at-grade trains. And I've also heard from traffic people, especially on the radio, who are saying that since it's at grade, it could actually wind up snarling traffic more, because it's physically in the same space as the cars, as vehicle traffic, and not up high like a SkyTrain or underneath like a subway.
Well, wasn't that one of the arguments against putting streetcars on Broadway, that it would just mess up traffic even more on Canada's busiest transit corridor? Yes,
exactly. And it's also one of the reasons why they say they need SkyTrain all the way out to UBC, so they don't have that all messed up in through there, the Arbutus area, as they call it. And so that's one of their arguments, that they're saying they needed a SkyTrain. And so now, all of these, tons and tons of working people, most of them with families, who live in Surrey and beyond, because few can afford to live on the other side of the river nowadays, are saying, hey, what about us? Why are we getting an at-grade train that will potentially just snarl traffic more? Why don't we actually put in a SkyTrain? And again, we'd have to take a real hard, long look at that as far as expense and cost and timing goes, because frankly, taxpayers are tapped out. Our friends at the Fraser Institute did their most recent report, and it's 43% of our incomes now go to taxes, fees, tolls, etc. That goes to government, various levels. So people can't pay any more. But if they can do better with the money they're already taking from us and have better service, if that includes a SkyTrain, then that's definitely something to look at.
Kris, is there a website that people can go to find out more about these issues?
Yes, and it's actually something, if you ever want to do research on this stuff, it's been a website now for a long time, and you can do tons of searches, and you can find some of our reports and our studies going years back, actually, and it's simply taxpayer.com. Taxpayer.com, and it's free to look at. There's no paywall, and you can do all sorts of research on there, and it's actually quite handy if you're trying to write pieces.
Kris, thanks a lot for being on the show.
Thank you so much for talking about these issues. They really matter to people.
My guest has been Kris Sims, BC Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. If you have any questions for Kris or any of our other guests, you can send them to info@howstreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. Thanks for listening.
Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. The Goddard Report is available online and mobile at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. The Goddard Report is a production of How Street Media Incorporated.